Peace be upon you, dear students. I hope you are safe and sound and you are taking advantage of this lockdown. Just consider the incredible flow of time that all of us have at our hands. These are times of distress for sure, but we can always turn troubles and tribulations into graces if only we have the will. In this short presentation, I share with you a loose correction of some of the questions in the task that I attached with the reading material about Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony. Now let's get started. Before you read, who is Antonio Gramsci? This is a simple question which is meant for informational purposes. Of course, we have to know something about the author and his life, but also for pedagogical and methodological purposes, because we have to keep in mind that intellectual productions cannot be disassociated or separated from their producers, that is from their authors and the context, the background within which they grew up and lived. Think of the biographical account of the author as a torch which illuminates gray areas and between the lines in his text, be it literary, philosophical, or theoretical. But for our purposes here, what is required is a concise intellectual biography and not a paragraph which is packed with irrelevant details and events from the life of the author. Now, back to the question. Who is Antonio Gramsci? Antonio Gramsci was born at the end of the 19th century. He was an Italian Marxist intellectual, but also staunch political activist. He was the founder and leader of the Italian Communist Party, and because of his activism, he was imprisoned by Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. It is there in prison that he wrote thousands of pages about or on political philosophy, language, and education. These pages were sorted out and collected later on, that is after his death, and were published as prison notebooks. Gramsci died prematurely, that is, while he was still young, in prison in 1937. Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony attests to the tremendous impact he has on, or rather his thought had on cultural studies. In fact, after the translation of his works into English in the 1970s, he himself, that is, Gramsci himself, acquired the status of a cult hero within the ranks of the Birmingham Center of Cultural Studies and beyond. And many critics appropriated his concept of cultural hegemony and applied it to cultural phenomena, which include race, gender, class, and media. Also keep in mind, before you read and while you are reading the article about Gramsci's concept of hegemony, that he, like many other Western Marxists, rejected the idea of economic determinism. That is, the idea that the social and economic conditions determine in a mechanical way the superstructure, that is, determine and shape the ideas and beliefs and values of people. We shall see the same attitude when we come to Louis Althusser's idea, or just concept of, or conception of ideology and ideological state apparatuses. The first question, how does Gramsci define hegemony? Hegemony is the ruling class's exercise of social control and leadership over subordinate classes through a combination of force and consent. It's important to retain these four words or four phrases as they constitute the cornerstone of the definition of hegemony: the ruling class's leadership and subordinate classes' consent. We will say more about this definition in the coming slides. Now, let me in this slide just go back to the etymology or etymological sense of the word hegemony. Hegemony etymologically means leadership, and hegemon means leader. And there is, of course, a difference between a boss and leader. A boss often forces you and constrains you and imposes things on you, often with symbolic violence or a threat of violence. But a leader induces you to do things and does not impose them on you. It induces you to do things on your own, and gives you the impression that he shares some interests with you and that he is interested in your own good. So it's very important to retain this sense of leadership and leaders. Second question, in a hegemonic order, dominance is won through consent. What does consent mean, and what is its opposite? Consent means willing and voluntary acceptance and acquiescence to the dominant order, and its opposite is coercion and force. Antonio Gramsci argues that because of the development of modern capitalistic societies, a development which is manifested in the expansion of schooling and education and civil rights, and the emergence of political parties and trade unions and pressure groups, and the organization of elections, because of all of these developments, rule cannot be based merely on force as it used to be in pre-capitalistic systems, but because of the nature of these societies, rule must be based on consent, primarily on consent, and force can be resorted to only in exceptional cases. Third question, what's the difference between Gramsci's concept of hegemony and the Marxian concept of ideology? There are two differences. First, hegemony, like ideology, refers to the values of the dominant classes. But in addition to that, it also refers to a series of processes, that is, in Arabic, sayrurat, processes through which these values are perceived as part of the natural order. These values and ideas are perceived by the dominant class as natural, as commonsensical, as inevitable, as something which is just there. As sometimes it is, these beliefs and values are assimilated as by subordinate classes as their own beliefs and values. The second difference is that ideology suggests that the subordinate classes or subordinate people are duped, they are deceived, and ideology is just imposed on them, while under hegemony, or hegemony suggests that people consent and give their willing acceptance and acquiescence to the dominant values and ideas. these ideas and values are not imposed on them as ideology and its corollary idea of false consciousness suggests. The fourth question. Hegemony occurs through a process of negotiation. What does this process entail from both the ruling class and the subordinate class or classes? Hegemony is the outcome of a process of negotiation and deliberation between social classes. That is, between the ruling class and subordinate class or classes. There can be many. A process which eventually leads into some sort of consensus and agreement between these classes. Hegemony entails concession on the part of the ruling class. That is, the ruling class has to make some concessions, has to leave some of their rights and give them to the subordinate classes. These concessions are mostly economic in nature, but they don't touch the essential. And think, for example, of the wage rises, rising wages of the working class in order to keep them in place and keep the order and gain their acceptance and consent. And the other thing which hegemony entails on the part of the masses is their consent, that is, their acquiescence to the dominant order. The masses and the subordinate classes accept the status quo, not because they are forced or indoctrinated, as classical Marxism suggests, but because they have reasons of their own. They have common interests, and they have an axe to grind. And this is why they entered into the negotiation in the first place. But I have to stress here that and warn you against taking the word negotiation in literally. Now, negotiation has historical causes and has historical context and causes which drove and incite these classes to engage in a kind of negotiation and deliberation, which is often and more often not explicit but implicit. It's kind of imposed or triggered by some historical causes and contexts. The fifth question. Hegemony is the outcome of an alliance that serves the interest of both the dominant class and subordinate class or classes. What three words on page 156 indicate that such an alliance is not strategic and permanent? Well, hegemony is, as I said, the outcome of a process of negotiation and deliberation between social classes, which culminates in an alliance between these classes. And if this alliance is solid enough, it culminates in what Gramsci calls a historical bloc. On a side note, this reminds me of Muhammad Abid al-Jabiri's famous call for a historical bloc in the Moroccan society. But this hegemony is neither stable nor fixed. Rather, it is constituted of compromises which are provisional and momentary. That is, hegemony is never inevitable and stable. And this opens the possibility for counter-hegemony, that is, an alternative hegemony, which is constituted of alternative values and ideas, which, if it is strong enough and stable enough, will substitute and replace the hegemonic order. Because hegemony takes place at the level of the superstructure, culture becomes the site of the struggle over meaning a meaning which can be won and lost, or shaped, modified, resisted, defended, and challenged. Okay, so there is always this possibility of a counter hegemony emerging and taking the lead. The sixth question. While coercion is exercised by the state, hegemony is carried out in and by civil society. What does the latter phrase refer to in Gramsci's terminology? Antonio Gramsci makes distinction between two levels of modern capitalistic societies: political government, which function through coercion, and civil society, which operates mainly through hegemony. Civil society includes institutions of the family, education, political parties, trade unions, and the institutions we mentioned earlier. And civil society is the site of cultural production and consumption, and it is where common sense is and the natural order is produced and consumed and manufactured. And it is because of this that civil society becomes the site and the locus of ideological struggle over meaning, over the making of common sense which guides everyday life. In other words, whoever dominates civil society becomes or achieves leadership. That is, if leadership is achievable mainly not at the level of political government, but mainly and primarily through society. You have to control society. You have to strive to make your worldview the dominant worldview, and to convince people in civil society. That is through school and through political parties and through trade unions, through those institutions which constitute democratic societies. It is through these institutions that you have to struggle and to convince people of your worldview until it becomes dominant and kind of commonsensical. It is then that the subordinate class will be able to overthrow or at least substitute the dominant class and the dominant hegemonic order. I'll leave it. Does that remind you of something about Althusser? Does something about Althusser ring in your heads? I leave it to you to think about at this point, to think about Gramsci's influence on Althusser. The seventh question. Is civil society, which category according to Gramsci assumes the role of asserting and maintaining hegemony in society? The answer is in one word: intellectuals. Intellectuals in Gramsci's sense are not restricted to that class of people who are educated and have some degrees and have some academic background and think and write and publish and give lectures. No. According to Gramsci, all people are intellectuals, but only few people assume the role of intellectuals in society. Think of intellectuals in the Gramscian sense as those individuals who are willing to stand on the side of the ruling class and defend the system. Think of intellectuals as journalists, TV presenters, university professors, teachers, but also student leaders and political leaders, trade union leaders, but also activists on the ground who might not have any academic degree or background. So all of these people are work from within the institutions of civil society and strive to present the dominant ideas, the ideas of the ruling class, in a coherent and convincing way in order to legitimate and justify the hegemonic order, that is the status quo. There is more to say about intellectuals in the Gramscian sense, and the subject is more complicated than that. Gramsci further divides intellectuals into two categories: traditional intellectuals and organic intellectuals, and he speaks in great detail about the role of education, etc., which influence some other intellectuals around the world. One of them is I forgot about his name. Is a Brazilian intellectual who championed adult education. Okay, so this is another topic, so I will leave that discussion to another session, and this brings me to the end of this presentation. Thank you and stay tuned.